Well, U.S. President Donald Trump is easing on China tariffs following a truce between the two countries at that G20 summit. Meanwhile, the U.S. is expanding its list of European tariff targets. Let's get some more analysis on this. Peter MacKay is a partner at Baker McKenzie and Canada's former foreign affairs minister. He joins us to weigh in on all this and the domino effect for Canada. Peter, thanks very much for being with us. So,
pleasure.
Let's start with what happened over the weekend between China and the U.S. There were big expectations going into the meeting. Now we walk away, and the takeaway seems to be truce for now. What was your observation?
Yeah, I think the president proves again that he effectively uses tariffs to leverage countries into the position he wants them to be in. He is still holding a gun in some ways, if I can put it that way, as far as some of the further tariffs that he could place on China, but on other countries as well. He has effectively used this strategy now for well over 2 years. Interestingly, there was no finality to the discussions with China. And what he did say was that with respect to Huawei, which is of interest to Canada,
Sure.
of course, it was status quo. Nothing had really changed. In fact, I think he said, we will wait till the very end of these discussions before we'll discuss Huawei. And so some relief. I think it stabilized the markets. I think people generally felt that the G20 vis-a-vis the US-China relationship had at least been neutralized for the time being. But no great advances. I think what we're seeing now is that when things don't get worse, we think that that's a win, which is a very low bar considering some of the other issues that are there, including climate change, where it was G19 plus 1. The United States did not sign on. That was not unexpected. But on that particular issue, we are still bumping along with no resolution as far as having the United States join the Paris climate change.
Now, since you mentioned Huawei and the fact that it doesn't seem to be dancing in with the other trade issues between the U.S. and China right now, were you surprised that it didn't? In other words, I think one of the fears that we've had, especially here in Canada, is that the president will start talking about Huawei. He'll start talking about, the extradition process, anything that centrally involves Canada in the mix of these trade talks, and further confuses matters.
Well, I think that's true. Huawei is very important to Canada. If the president had more musings with respect to connecting the extradition of the Huawei executive being held in Canada with his decision to drop sanctions, to drop tariffs, to move forward as vis-a-vis Huawei, this would be problematic for Canada because it again reinforces that the rule of law process that's happening here in Canada is somehow illegitimate, or it puts us in a more difficult place. Canada, of course, did not move forward. I would suggest that this is, it's not a step back, but it's nowhere near being back. We essentially did not have an official bilateral with China. We had what was called in diplomatic terms a pull-aside on the way to a cultural event. The Prime Minister spoke about that, but gave very scant details. And of course, nothing came from the Chinese. And interestingly, nothing came from Donald Trump as to whether he made an intervention on behalf of Canada. So,
which was something that came out, like when the Prime Minister went to the White House, reporters started asking about that, and we had to sort of speculate here, is the president going to be having that conversation on Canada's behalf when he's talking trade issues with China?
And I think that was the number one ask of that White House visit, and yet we have no confirmation that the president did make that intervention. Interestingly, though, John, he did say that China was going to start buying a lot of agricultural products from the United States as a result of whatever détente was reached in terms of no further sanctions. The question I would have, and I think others have, is does that mean that China will now be buying pork and canola and meat products that they would have otherwise bought from Canada? So we may, in fact, find ourselves further behind the 8 ball. And there's a lot of people now questioning whether we should change tacks and, in fact, do what some, including Andrew Scheer, have said, and that is pull out of the Asia Development Bank, look at sanctions of our own, student visas, certain issues that at least show that Canada is not turtling. And turtling is never a good position to be in when it comes to dealing with a bully, which is what China has been acting like.
And I think you know, as we've talked to a lot of trade experts recently on where things go next, if China is making it more challenging for Canadian agriculture players to get their product into China, what's to say there isn't a challenge for some of the big financial services companies in this country who are trying to expand into that market? And I say that because one of the stories we were talking about this morning is Genworth, a big U.S. player which had reached a deal with China but has this big mortgage insurance unit in Canada, that regulators in the U.S. were on board with that deal, but Canadian regulators were not on board with that deal, which raises the question: Are we moving towards a tit for tat with China in terms of Chinese companies being able to expand in Canada or do business in Canada and vice versa?
Well, what the foreign minister has said, and she's quoting the prime minister, is that we're not going to escalate, but we're not going to back down. That doesn't seem like a strategy that's working thus far. And frankly, Canada is in a vulnerable position, to say the least. There are not that many levers that we can pull, but there are some. And what China has done is escalate steadily, including the taking into custody of Canadians and changing the sentence for another Canadian. And that has to be a primary concern. But all of this, of course, is going against the backdrop of a pending federal election in Canada. And while foreign affairs are not always the most prominent issue, this is starting to impact very directly on the economy. It's certainly hitting the ag sector. It may, in fact, hit others. I fear, of course, retaliation from China or further acts against our fisheries, against other products that we send to their country. And so we have to somehow try to continue to reach out to other allies, including the U.S., but we have to be able to show something directly. We have to be able to hit back at some point and say enough is enough. And we don't have ambassadors in either country. We don't have very many lines of communication that are open other than hopefully reliable allies. And that has not exactly been the signal coming from the United States thus far, that they're willing to do our bidding.
The other piece that we should get to, because we've mentioned it a couple times this morning, is the U.S. now targeting Europe. This really has a lot to do with aerospace subsidies and zeroing in on Airbus and the battle that we've seen between Boeing and Airbus. But the idea...
And Lockheed Martin.
And Lockheed Martin. The idea of the U.S., after getting through a busy weekend with China, the trip to North Korea by the president, and now trade representatives in the U.S. targeting Europe with potential new tariffs. What was your reaction to that?
Well, it's further evidence of the disruptor in chief. I think the president is not happy unless somebody's unhappy, and he really tries to keep people on their back foot, keep countries guessing as to what he may do next. But let's be clear, he's been very effective in terms of his efforts to reset the table vis-a-vis trade imbalances, that is, deficits that are very real for the United States of America. In the meantime, their economy is booming. Their energy sector, they're now independent in terms of exporting energy. They have lower taxes, less regulation. Investment is flowing into the United States at an impressive rate. So his strategy of going after other countries' economies, trying to use tariffs very much as a leverage tool, has been working. Now, how long it will work and how much long-term damage that this will do to not only relationships but to businesses, to certain sectors of the economy, is yet to really be gauged. But for the president going into an electoral cycle starting really this fall or before Christmas, this has been very advantageous to the economy of the United States of America. And that's what his focus has been from the start. That's what he has boasted about. And his job numbers and the numbers of the United States in terms of trade imbalance back him up in terms of his success.
I thought it was, the more interesting point recently was that now you're having these Democratic candidates battle off in these high-profile evening events, and a growing list of them are talking about China as being the biggest issue for the U.S., which one wonders if that plays right into the president's hands when it comes to who's dealing best with China.
Well, the president has set the agenda, and when you see others, as you've pointed out, filing in behind him and talking about his issue, again, in terms of electoral fortunes, he wins. Yeah. And he has had a fair degree of success. We have to begrudgingly give him that when it comes to China. We, of course, are paying a price, in some cases, for his success.
Interesting. Peter, always good to get your perspective. Lots of moving parts. Peter MacKay, partner at Baker McKenzie and the former Foreign Affairs Minister, joining us here on this Tuesday morning.